Recorded.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
I have a random question for John. uh, how do you do that? Like turn on your camera and your microphone?
How do I
When
turn them on?
I mean, they appear like they come on immediately when you need to speak. So I'm wondering if there's like some setting in Zoom where when you unmute, you also like turn on your video.
I just click the two buttons.
Oh, okay.
It's very manual. I wish I had a better answer.
I know. I just think that's a nice way of managing.
There's Alt A and V as well if you want keyboard shortcuts, but you have to be in the window.
Oh, okay, yeah, shortcuts. Of course, shortcuts.
So, Josh, I guess you've got the one agenda item. Let's throw it on over to you.
Yeah, sure. So I know we've been beating the horse on this topic, but reference types group is closed, and our suggested changes made it into the necessary place, and we have these GitHub milestones with some things to close out. I guess I just want to get a general gauge from especially like the registry providers of the world. Like we talked about at the end of the month for the Cloud Native Security Con, potentially doing a release. I can definitely put an effort to get the conformance stuff off the ground, but how do we feel about actually doing a release? Do we need more time? Is there too many unanswered questions?
I don't know if John is just too polite to say, oh, there's the hand. I think John had some points. He's not too polite.
I'm not. Yeah, I mean, I have a PR open, and I think Brandon and I are going back and forth. Well, we were. I have not paid attention in the last week or so, but I TLDR don't want to add annotations in the referrer's response. and Brandon thinks that sucks. And I think we may be at an impasse. So I don't know. Let me find the link.
Yeah, I think reviewing all the different discussions and ideas that have gone back and forth on that one. Thanks for getting that link out there. My gut reaction is if this went out without including the annotations within the OCI index response that we get back, that I would probably do something client side to put in there and just ignore the refers API.
Can you clarify what do you mean? You would just not implement the refers API or not consult the refers API in the client?
I would probably query the refers API and then use that to generate my own index and push that back up to the registry under a special tag.
I don't know, John, does that seem that bad? I think the last comment on one of these is, I think it's reasonable. John's saying, I think it's reasonable to expect clients to do some work here. I think that more or less is what you're describing, right? The client would do some work that the client wants to do to make this into a format that they can process better. I don't think that's so bad as a workaround.
I think it's quite bad. I'm an outside developer using OCI. I'm an engineer at Pulumi, and we're looking at using OCI registry as a distribution mechanism for plugins. And I agree. I read through the thread with Brandon and John, and if the refers API doesn't return annotations, and we have a wide variety, say, of different types of artifacts being referred, then we have to make a select n+1 effectively against the registry. And this is particularly bad for rate limited registries, right? Like this blows up your Docker Hub or GHCR token rate limits extremely quickly. And the compromise, I think, would be probably those registries would they would not want to, I think, omit some API calls from rate limiting, right? So we would have to end up not using the refers API. We would have to use a special tag format and push our own indexes.
So I think yeah, that totally makes sense. Nobody wants to require folks to make n+1 requests to get this. Part of John's proposal was to, instead of the annotations, use the data field that already exists and say registries. I forget the exact phrasing we have, so like don't listen to this as word, but registries can respond with the data field, including the entire manifest, which includes the annotations and much more. So a client could expect the registry to give all of that back. I think at one point I remember making the proposal that we could say registries may promote annotations, registries may include the data field with the whole manifest, registries must do one of both, one or both of A or B. In which case the client wouldn't be required to make all of those requests, but would be required to do some work to decide whether the registry had returned A or B, or A or B, or A and B, and figure out which one they wanted. I think that's my sort of best guess at how we're going to unlogjam. I'm curious again if John or Brandon think that's
the must do either is
bad.
Yeah, the text for must do one or the other is not in the PR right now.
Okay, is the PR version should return, or the registry must return? This is may include annotations and would return something, would return an annotation on the index that says whether they had returned them.
I have a question for, I think it was Aaron. So n+1, certainly a problem. will you say if artifact type filtering existed, is that sufficient to help you out, or do you anticipate there being, say, dozens of things that you'll need to check? Like, what are you trying to do here, and what would you put in annotations that you need on this response, if you can say?
Yeah, I think already we're seeing some conversations about things like what's the appropriate artifact type for SBOM was a active thread, and whether or not we can, what that type is going to be is going to return one or potentially many different SBOM types. For our case, it would probably be, N would be at least, so on the order of probably at least 6, because we're targeting the tuples of every OS and architecture that we support. So Windows, Mac, Linux, and x86 and ARM64. And it's been a little uncertain whether or not we should use the platform field in that case, because we're not technically publishing like Docker layers or in Docker image manifest, we're publishing artifacts. So for those plugins, we would want to publish at least 6 for a given artifact type.
To throw another example out there from things I've been thinking about is if you did a vulnerability scan every, once a day, once a week, something like that, and you wanted to expire the old one, but you didn't have some kind of client-side cleanup of the old vulnerability scans, you might have this thing getting created on the registry every day, and the only thing you've got to look at is a creation timestamp as an annotation in there. Without that, you don't know which one to pull, and so you have to pull every one of them to figure out which one hadn't expired yet.
Unless it was inlined in the data field and was extractable that way.
Assuming you can get that in the index, yeah.
Would it be, would you accept a change to this PR, Brandon, that said registries must do A or B and may do A or B?
I think the question goes to John.
Yeah, I shouldn't. Yeah. Okay. Let's start with John. John, why is that a bad idea?
I want the registry to be able to make decisions about this. So like if you've pushed something that is very, very large, always inlining that is probably a bad idea, especially if you're not going to fetch it as a client. But if an artifact is small enough that, say, it's already inlined in your storage and you have access to it by just listing things, then it is easy to inline that in the response, and it doesn't blow up the response tremendously.
I think my proposed language covers that case. Like a registry implementation may return A or B on a per request basis. On Tuesdays we return the data, and on Wednesdays we return the annotations. Like that's a valid conformant implementation according to my idea.
Right, but I don't ever want to return annotations if I can avoid it.
Oh, you're saying so you're saying you either want to return the data or nothing and make people go get the manifest. In that case, how would you, bouncing back to Brandon, how about may do A, may do B, should do A or B?
Are you asking if I would accept a should? Like I say,
if I argue you down to a should.
If I get a referrer's response back that does not have all the data I want, I'm probably going to have to switch to client-side management of my own index.
Which means like fetching.
Doing the fallback effectively, but without the registry's permission at that point, because the registry is trying to say, hey, I've got this new API here, use it. And I'm saying your API isn't good enough for me, so I'm going to do my own thing.
I think that's a reasonable negotiation between the registry and the client in that case, right? Like if the registry doesn't want, if John's registry never ever wants to return an annotation and is fine with getting more requests from the client as a result of their decision, then that's, I think, a reasonable negotiation between the two.
The question I would have is, do we really want to do that in the first place? Because what we're saying is we're going to make an API that we know that a lot of clients aren't going to find useful, and the clients can just fall back at that point. Why does the registry have to implement the new API? Why not not implement the new API and just call yourself OCI v1 instead of 1.1?
That is also a perfectly reasonable place to exist, and I think John's place to exist on that continuum might also be not to implement 1.1. I have no idea. I think that there is still a benefit to returning the refers API, even if it's going to be, in your formulation, incomplete and require the client to do more work. It's useful because it doesn't pollute the tag space, basically. Even if it doesn't remove API requests, it doesn't pollute the tag space, which is nice.
But the client side fallback when it runs into that is to pollute the tag space.
Your implementation, your proposed idea for fallback would be to do that. A different one could be to always request 100 more requests than it needs. And again, if the registry doesn't want clients to do that, it has tools to do that, including giving it the information it wants up front. I feel like we're dangerously close to coming to an agreement, and I don't want to let up on the pressure until one of you relents.
So my holdup is I don't want to have to fetch and parse every manifest when I'm generating a list. I don't want to, we could do a materialized view, but I don't really want to. I don't want to have to rely on a cache of this response that gets generated. And I also don't want to index and store arbitrary annotations that the client provides. This is much less flexible for clients, but if, say, we were required to have the creation time annotation, if present, that's something I would be amenable to. But for arbitrary annotations of arbitrary size, it's very annoying to implement, and I'm afraid of that. I'm afraid of the implications of indexing and filtering on arbitrary key values. That is not really how our backend is set up to behave, and it would be a large change.
Are we talking about indexing and filtering? Are we talking about filtering on these annotations, or just showing them, promoting them in the response to
to me, I'd like to see it implemented in a way that, well, I'm making assumptions about how the back end of some of these registries are running, but I'd like to see it implemented of, I have this manifest either created or deleted. When I see that, I know where to find the existing index response that I've already generated in the past and add or remove a record to that. And so you're never maintaining, other than just that whole index response that you can cache, you're never maintaining an individual table of all the different annotations and everything else. You're just maintaining that response of the index field.
I don't think that's how I'm thinking about implementing it.
Yeah, that pushes our consistency guarantees out the window, which would be annoying.
Yeah.
Michael, did you say you weren't thinking about implementing it that way, or you were?
Yeah, I just didn't want John to be the only one talking about that being an uncomfortable idea. We also, I think, looked at various ways to implement this, and we're not a fan of keeping a bunch of little pieces of data in sync.
That also seems reasonable to me. That's sort of part of why I'm pushing on this, is I want to find some way, if a registry is implemented in such a way that this is easy for them, or is is something they're interested in doing, I think it's a useful thing to keep around for the client to know that they might get that data. But I think, to John and Michael's point, requiring registries to do this puts a lot of onus on the registry, and the registry is doing a lot for a lot of people.
Yeah,
you also get into, sorry, go ahead.
If there was a finite set of annotations, a small set of predefined annotation keys that are in the OCI spec that like, oh yeah, your like registry should return these. That is much more palatable than arbitrary key values, in my opinion. Like we can do that. We can index on that. We can store that since it's unbounded. But if like I am required to return every annotation, I need to store that somewhere, then I run into like potential limitations on storage engines, and it blows up sizes of things, and cache goes out the window.
I think we can solve some of the, well, with only a little bit more work, we can solve some of those by saying annotations must be under 1,000 bytes, or annotations, you may not have more than 100 annotations or something like that. I don't think that's a good solution, because I think like the way that we're going to do it is to impose a ton of restrictions on people for the registry's benefit. Your registry could also do this, right? Your registry could just say, you gave me an annotation with 30 megabytes of data in the value. No, I'm not gonna, I'm gonna reject that right away. But yeah, I sort of, to go back to the bargaining table, Brandon, what if we had 3 annotation keys that we require registries to promote and none other?
I don't want to try to figure out what the keys are now, because whatever we pick today is not going to be enough for what people want to do with it tomorrow. Someone's going to come up with a new key. Thinking of image signing, they want to know who the signer is, so they're going to have a signer fingerprint. The next person comes out with a new annotation or a new artifact type is going to have a new field they want to put in there. So instead of going that direction, does it make sense to index and track the full descriptor, and then to say the full descriptor needs to have some kind of max length when you marshal it in a certain way?
That's more or less the same as what I was proposing, of like the descriptor may not have more than 100 annotations, and there may not be more than a kilobyte per annotation value or whatever.
There have been different ways to look at it. One is that you'd go per individual annotation. I'm thinking about it as like for an entire descriptor, and then the registry is just saying, hey, this descriptor references this other one, so I just need to query my list of 5 descriptors I'm going to find. Do a quick join on with a comma between it. Now you've got your index.
I have a question that might derail us further and might prove that this is moot. I'm going to take the gambit. What about unknown fields, right? If instead of an annotation called brandon.signature.fingerprint, I just add a field to my descriptor that is Brandon's signature fingerprint, is the references response required to include that unknown field?
No, we're only, the descriptor is generated. And so the descriptor is going to be generated off of the media type, the size, the digest, and your annotations. So you wouldn't be able to put any other thing from your manifest to pull in there.
Gotcha. So because the reason we don't drop unknown fields when you push a manifest is because that is content addressed and important not to drop.
It's fixed.
You would push that manifest, that would exist in the manifest, that unknown field. But then when the references response hoists it into the index response, it
build a descriptor. Yeah,
it's allowed to drop that. Is that explicitly stated anywhere?
We explicitly state how you build the descriptor, of saying you need to include annotations, and the rest of it is kind of assumed with media type, size, and digest.
I'm worried about the fuzziness of that assumption, but I think that's fine. I don't think my gambit did either of the things I thought it would do, but at least it didn't derail us further. My bigger fear kind of goes down that path of, if we fall back to clients managing this, that clients managing the index, you might get different clients putting new features in the index that old clients don't know about. And that's fine until an old client updates the index and drops the new features. And so I really want to push to get us to a point where the registry is the one maintaining the index, not the clients. But I think I can summarize the general shape of this argument as Brandon advocates for clients to be simpler, and John and Michael and me advocate for registries to be simpler. And I think like somewhere in the middle is where we will all come to a happy medium. I mean, maybe Aaron's on your side too, I'm not sure. And Josh is just sort of a loose cannon. But yeah, I think like in general, we have to decide whether whether the registry will do the lifting or whether the client will do the lifting. Someone's got to lift.
Yeah.
Someone's got to do something.
Oh, the other big challenge is if the clients don't standardize how they do their lifting, it only works for the client with write access. Doesn't work for the client with only read access. They can't push something back up to that registry and cache their findings.
Again, I think you're describing your own personal specific implementation of how you would work around this by pulling everything, caching it, and pushing it back to the registry. You could also write it to disk. You could also keep it in memory. You could also do nothing. I don't think that is I don't think that's an argument for why the registry needs to do this, because maybe the client could do something else, right? I'm trying to come up with more creative ways not to or to loosen this in the spec so that we can all come to some agreement. Yeah, Nisha, you got your hand up.
So, general question, I would think that John's request for not processing annotations would not affect another registry's implementation of the spec. Does the spec now say that it must include annotations, or may include annotations? I forgot whether the refers API depends on the annotation or not.
The spec currently says annotations must be hoisted. John's PR changes it to may with a signal that it didn't hand the thing back.
Yeah, I mean, so that would depend upon the registry implementation, Aaron, that the rate limiting part. I mean, Docker Hub may rate limit, but somebody else may make an implementation that will do the heavy lifting instead, and then clients are free to choose whatever registry works for them.
Yeah,
Well, that's what I was trying to say with like the negotiation part, right? Like if you and your registry have a different idea of how many requests you should be allowed to make, or how, not even requests, right? How you should be able to discover this data efficiently, but also quickly. If your registry says, ping me 1,000 times for this, oh wait, no, you can only ping me 100 times per second, then you are free to find a different registry, or at least complain to your customer service person at that registry to like be more consistent with their feedback. Sorry, Aaron, you were about to say something. I cut you off.
yeah. I mean, I think that a lot of people don't get to choose their registry, right? That's part of the problem. Is there's an artifact that's published somewhere, or there's a popular tool, as maybe some open source tool, and I'm just a regular person. I'm Joe Schmo, and I'm downloading my artifacts, and oh, I ran it in a CI script, and now it's rate limited. And this has the potential to cause that rate limiting to happen much more quickly. And especially when you talk about publishing, like we want this ecosystem to be quite large, to have a large number of sort of associated artifacts that potentially associated with a manifest. That means that this problem will only get worse and worse as it goes on, right? Like today it's going to be 10 associated artifacts. Tomorrow it could be 100. In a year it could be 1,000. And so you get to the point where we would literally not even be able to query an item and all of its related artifacts to find the needle that you wanted.
Yeah, I think at some point, like the scale argument of what if I have 100 billion things attached to something, right? My answer to that becomes you are using OCI wrong. Like not you, the client, right? Like somebody somewhere is using OCI as a document storage of arbitrary size, and those don't exist in this plane of existence. So I think right, like I don't think you were saying that scale is what we're talking about, but somewhere between here and there, OCI stops being a good solution for the problem you're trying to solve. I think I jumped the line on hands. I'm sorry, everyone.
Whereas I was curious about maybe pulling a little bit more on registries should return annotations, or registry should return a data field as long as it doesn't exceed a certain size. And then it's sort of a, I don't know, a carrot for clients creating manifests to not shove a bunch of stuff in annotations, and it's a way for registries to maybe store all their manifest stuff in a performance storage system that doesn't have to deal with unbounded data. I feel like something like that kind of came up. Would that be enough for clients, and is that something that servers would be more amenable to if we put some sort of size limit into either the size of the annotations or the size of the data field?
I think you want to make it the size of the full descriptor or individual annotations.
Yeah,
one or the
it
other.
has to be overall, either overall annotations or overall manifest size.
Yeah,
Brandon,
if it's
if
going to
that
be
was-
overall, then I would say overall descriptor size.
If that was a thing, that small enough descriptors should be included in the data field, and larger descriptors that John doesn't want to put in the data field are allowed to be offloaded, would that be okay?
Can we bypass the whole data field at that point and say, since we know exactly how big the descriptor is, we don't need a data field?
No, this still goes to, I think, to the point that John didn't want to have to process annotations at all. John being the like proxy for a person who runs it, like, I don't know. It's not just John. I
guess my first suggestion is sort of closer to what we have now. We return a bunch of descriptors, they have annotations, but it only returns annotations if the size is under a certain limit, is my first proposal. That's still not good enough. Then what if we move from annotations to a data field that has the manifest encoded in it, and stick with a size limit of some reasonable size?
I feel like there's a question there. I'm going a different direction, so I want to leave this open for John to respond.
There's so many hands. Yeah, from like a purity perspective, it's frustrating to be like, oh, there's a size limit. But practically there is a size limit of like what I would be willing to do. So like we could store and serve annotations. That would be okay if either I'm allowed to say reject something because we failed to store it, right? Or you're okay with that being potentially missing. Like we could store an annotation that says, hey, we couldn't serve these annotations as part of the referrer's response. You have to go fetch this because it's too big. Like that could be a proxy for the actual annotations. But yeah, I mean, if I can do something reasonable when my size limit has been reached and not like an arbitrary one that we all decide upon, that would be helpful, because then it's not just like, in 2022, 2023, we decided this is a reasonable size for a thing. Similarly to like the manifest size, right? Like registries have limitations. We should have an error or something that indicates, oh, you hit my limit. Here's what you need to do.
I think when we talked about the manifest size limit, this exact thing came up, and I think the language, I would have to go like borrow that language, but basically registries can impose any arbitrary limit they want on these annotations. Clients should expect at least X, which doesn't require the registry to do anything. It just says, hey clients, if you're pushing a 10 megabyte manifest, some registries might not support it. Some support it. 4 megabytes, I think, was the line of like, you should reasonably expect that a 4 megabyte manifest is allowed by registries.
And And should
I
that
think we
be
can
rejected on manifest push, or should we reject it on the refers API and just filter them out?
Well, so for the manifest size limit, the registry would reject it on manifest push, right? For this annotation limit we're proposing, I think it would be the manifest is allowed to be pushed, but as a result, the annotations, the 20 million annotations you put in there are not returned by the references API. But I think the wording is going to be important, and I think we landed after a long time landed on good wording for the manifest size limit, and I want to make a note to borrow that wording because I think it was a good compromise between user expectations and registry flexibility and future proofing. Yeah.
Sajay, what's the comment there about proxy annotations?
If we aren't returning an annotation, would we be able to say per descriptor in the refers API that we did not return the data field or any of the annotations? A hint for the clients to actually go fetch it.
Yeah, I think we need that too, right?
Okay.
Similarly, along the lines of John's PR right now, we need to say, I didn't give you something. I'm not giving you nothing. I didn't give you something. You need to go ask me again.
Then we have a deterministic behavior, right? Like clients can go fetch it, and rate limiting aside, that's a costing client problem. But the client can deterministically say that, yes, I didn't get this, and I can construct the whole API and expand the refers on the client.
Now, previously we did those annotations at the index level, not the individual descriptor level. If we're going to do this for individual descriptors, we need to be able to say which individual descriptors they were. And so if you try to do it on the annotation of that descriptor, we've got a conflict there. We can set that either in our manifest or in the descriptor from the registry. And there's potential that someone can make a manifest that just sets that field.
Yeah, and I think maybe reserving, I don't know how we want to do that because you don't have a property that says that, right? Like it's one of those things that the annotation can be present in the manifest or in, and if whether we hoisted that fake annotation from the manifest. Yeah, but I don't know how the solution should look, but an indication that this was not returned is, if we are planning it to do per descriptor, we need to define that as well in the PR. That's kind of where I was going.
Yeah.
But also, please don't make multiple clients update the same index, multiple different types of clients, SPOM clients, different WASM clients, as well as it's just going to be really difficult. So really hope we don't lose the refer API.
Yeah, if we try to set this instead of doing an annotation, I would think of a custom field. Might make more sense because you can't touch a custom field from the manifest. And then you put that in the descriptor of saying, hey, you don't have any annotations here because
I think we could just have a reserved annotation. And if you use it as not the refers response, then you might get weird behavior. You might think that it's somewhere else and it isn't. But that's on you because you touched the electric fence. I'm a little hesitant to start adding new fields because we're going to argue about those too. We already have
we don't argue about anything. I was just saying.
With the reserved annotation, I can just store that as the annotations, and there's not any logic on the serving side that's like, oh, were there too many annotations? Right? It's just a sentinel value that is, oh, I can just always serve this annotations field as part of the descriptor. So that's like nice and lazy.
So I think we're saying you can't just always serve it. You're only allowed to serve it if a client exceeds a limit.
And John's limit may be 0.
Well, what I'm saying is that
I want to say that a registry must support a minimum size like we do for manifest. So
what I'm saying is on push, I can store this once as the annotations if it's too large to store. And then on the serving side, it's identical for both paths, which is kind of nice.
Not that you were always going to set it, but you, yeah. Gotcha. Sorry for misrepresenting you, John. Aaron, you've had your hand up very patiently for a long time. I'm sorry about that.
No worries. I was just going to say, I'm very much in favor of registries rejecting an artifact manifest if it would violate the requirements for projecting the annotations in the referrer's API. So that way clients could rely on always having annotations available. And I guess implementing on the implementer side of implementing the referrer's API, it would also be simpler, is that you would know, for example, that you're going to have a bounded size there as well, right? So, and you get that feedback up front when you're pushing the artifact that you're going to do you're blowing up clients or the registry by doing this absurdly large manifest push.
I think I tend to agree with you. I think the reason, the only sort of hesitation I have about it is if a registry changes what that limit is. Like if today it's 10 annotations and tomorrow I lower it to 5, then your pushes start to fail, as opposed to your pushes are accepted, but your references API calls will require you to make another request to get the last 5 annotations or whatever. I don't know in practice how likely that is in real life, or if I'm just being like,
I guess,
pedantic about it.
I would hope that the spec would grandfather in, right? Like any existing pushed artifacts with a subject field would have to be returned as is, and that response maintained. And if the registry decides to change their limit from a kilobyte for a descriptor, because going back to what Brandon's saying is like, we probably care about the bulk size of the descriptor, not necessarily the number or size of each individual annotation. If they change that limit to 1/10 of what it was, I should still get the existing referrers API should be unchanged. I would hope that would be the case.
Yeah, I think so too.
So the one point I was going to make, and didn't want to derail the conversation earlier, was that as a client, I want to make sure that whenever we add this API on the server side, that I don't lose functionality. And so that's a big key thing to me of, if I'm going to lose functionality, I'm just not going to use the new API. I'm going to keep going with the old thing. And so the value to me having the server do it is that I'm going to gain functionality. And so I think we as OCI, and we're defining this, should make sure that we don't introduce the case where we're going to say, okay, you lose functionality here by getting this new feature.
But
can you give an example?
I think we would say any changes we make to the refers API, we would also make to the fallback stuff.
Yeah.
Like, so
originally we weren't, though. Originally we were saying, hey, the registry may exclude some of these, but all of the fallback scenarios should include all of the annotations. And so if we're saying whatever we're going to do for the new feature, yeah.
I think it's unlikely that. Sorry, go ahead.
The fallback implementation is that I, the client, push an index manifest that I want to see back when I get that tag again, right? Like the registry should not make any modifications to that when I push a manifest with that tag. So if it does, like that's real bad. It could, I guess, reject it.
But when I go from that fallback tag to hitting the refers API and the registry is now generating that index, I shouldn't lose functionality getting that new index from the registry's API versus what I was pushing originally as a client. And so that was where I was going back to the original thing of saying, well, if the registry may start excluding a lot of these things in there, I'm going to lose functionality from a client side by using that new API. And so that's a degradation, not an improvement to me at that point.
Yeah, but I think it's unlikely that clients would decide to implement their own fallback and not have interoperability with other clients as adoption grows.
What's the downside to a client? If you're only doing signatures and you know that every signature that you pushed up to the image that you're verifying came from your tool, there's no need to interoperate with the SBOM tool because you're only doing signatures, or vice versa.
Ultimately, aren't we talking about a degradation specifically just for really large manifests?
I think
It's a degradation of the
Aaron,
workflow. It's
Aaron
the
has his,
workflow of saying I need to query a registry and find my one signature that I'm looking for this thing. And if I have to go back, if I can do that with 2 calls of I pull the index and then I pull my one signature that I'm looking for, that's great. If I'm querying the registry and I don't go hit the refers API and it doesn't give me all the data, now I have to make 50 calls. That's not great. And so as a client writer, I'm going to write a client that can do it in only 2 calls. Nisha, I know I was kind of talking over you there, I think.
no, I was just saying, like, Aaron had his hand up, and probably people had not seen it because there's a sign behind that in his background that's yellow.
I wasn't sure if it was a stale hand.
I forgot to put my hand down. I'm sorry.
Brandon, at least for me, if I were to not include annotations in something, it is the same reason for which I would reject the index that you would construct manually. And so the client couldn't fall back and get a better response.
You would refuse a push with a tag with a certain value, with a certain name.
Over a certain size, yeah.
Well,
We're talking about
the overall manifest for an index has to be below a certain size. We've got the 4 meg limit there.
Right.
So, John, just if you would reject that index, then would the proposal to reject pushing the artifact, which sets the subject field, just reject it at that point? That way you have feedback at the point. That way the producer of the artifact has the feedback that something is going to break, as opposed to the client. Because I think the problem is if I can push an artifact that then some clients will not see or be able to find due to the refers API behaving differently. And I think clients are going to, I think it's an eager assumption, I think, to assume that clients are going to correctly implement falling back to querying each individual one. If they're either going to assume the refers API works and returns annotations, or they're going to always fall back and always query every manifest, I think. So if we just rejected the initial push, don't we get that feedback signal to the right person, the person creating the related artifact?
Yeah, that would work. The slight wrinkle of a difference there is like the refers response is an aggregate of all these things. And so like when you're at push time, yeah, we could reject something that's too large. But like if at fallback time, say, if we are not returning annotations for some reason, and you're constructing an index that has multiple things with, say, megabyte sized annotations, that's more likely to be rejected than if we were to reject the initial request. Like there is a point at which we would reject the artifact outright. That is a very similar point at which we would fail to store the number of annotations, right? Because very likely, if you're constructing a giant artifact, it is almost exclusively going to be annotations or embedded data. So like we could reject it, and we will at some point, but would you rather it be rejected, let's say at a slightly lower limit on the order of megabytes, or would you rather it be accepted because we can actually store it? It's just that when you get the refers API, you get a sentinel value instead of the annotations. Would you rather this thing be portable across multiple registries, and have clients add this extra logic to fallback fetching, or would you rather it get rejected and then you have to go back and like reconstruct this artifact for all the other registries that would have accepted it?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think I'm thinking of a couple things here. One is my bias would be I would want it to be rejected up front because I don't want to have a more complicated client implementation. And I think that there's going to be many more clients than there are going to be servers. And so my bias is almost always towards simpler client implementations. Just produces fewer faults and regressions down the road. The second is I want things like or as copy and the ability to copy things between registries and the ability to, I guess I want a uniform experience as a client. And actually I have a question, John. You mentioned the size of the response from the refers API. If I push 1,000 artifacts referring to this with the subject set to the same manifest, that could also, with even omitting annotations, blow up the 4 megabyte limit, right?
Yeah, but with the refers API, I can paginate you, whereas
Okay.
with the fallback index, I can't paginate that.
Okay. I guess I would be okay with a lower limit. Yeah.
To me, my fear is I'm looking at a different extreme use case, because we've got the extreme use case if someone makes a really giant manifest with thousands of annotations, and I'm comfortable limiting that. My fear is you've got 1,000 artifacts and you're trying to figure out which one you want to pick from that. And so you're going to have an index with 1,000 entries. Each entry is going to be 500, maybe 1 kilobyte in size. That's going to be well under the 4 megabyte limit. You can, if you had 500 bytes per descriptor there, you're talking 8,000 entries in there within a 4 megabyte. So you can pack a lot of descriptors within that 4 megabyte limit. So thinking through that scenario, I'm looking at, I want to make sure we don't break that extreme use case, because I can see what we're creating now extending for a whole lot of different various kinds of pieces of metadata. And it might be that one kind of metadata might have a lot of instances of itself that's just different date stamps, different key signers, different, pick some arbitrary annotation in there. And we need to be able to figure out which one is from that list. And so if we need to limit the overall size of the descriptor, I'm good. If we're going to say that we're going to push it over to some kind of fallback where the client is going to have to fetch each one of those manifests, that's bad for me. And that's where I would want to fall back to the fallback, because that's giving me more functionality in that case. And of course, we got 2 conversations, one in the chat and one out loud. Yeah, the pagination, that's definitely something that we get out of having the refers API. We eliminate race conditions. That's another great thing. We get a lot more consistency. So there's a lot of value to having the registry do this for us. I just want to make sure we don't lose the value that we're having right now within the fallback.
Yeah, I just took a glance of pagination API. Thanks, Sajay, for pointing me to that. It looks like it doesn't specify that there's a minimum number of required entries in each page. So if you wanted to implement the maximum response size there as well, right? Like cap the size of the descriptor on that you embed. And if you get to n entries and that's more than 4 meg, then you truncate there, and that any future entries become part of the next page.
Yeah, that was the design. And we knew that any individual entry for a descriptor would be less than 4 meg because it's coming from a manifest that had to itself be less than 4 meg.
There is some overhead, right? The index container is some number of, but if I did 4 megabytes exactly in a manifest, I couldn't return that whole manifest in the reference.
There's a slight bit of overhead, but it's really hard to get there because you still have to have your individual layers within the manifest. You're still putting other fields in that manifest itself that it's gotten. So
yeah. Challenge accepted, but I mostly agree with you.
I also think it's just a little cleaner to just say I'm gonna query for the first 100 referrers, not query for a refer, check if I hit 4 megabytes, query for another refer, check if I hit 4 megabytes, and kind of keep doing that.
Yeah, I'm fine if the registry wants to do it that way. That's fine with me.
And I'm just saying it's easier to do that. Say query for 100 if you know that all of those 100 things will be similar sized. If
Or
they're
capped
not
in their
similar
size.
size, then you have to kind of go with more of a size. Yeah.
So in that case, if we've got 4 megs for a limit, we want to do 100 of these. And we've got is that 4 kilobytes? Or am I off by a factor of 10?
Is there a practical change to John's change we wanted to make or propose, or a separate change? I don't want to lose the spirit of almost coming to an agreement and have to wait until next week to have the same almost agreement. Does anyone remember what we agreed on the most or the closest to, so that we could put that in a PR and start trying to agree to it in writing? We only have 4 minutes left.
In if people would rather me reject something at push time or omit something in the refers API if it's burdensome to store.
It sounded from this discussion like people would tend to prefer you to reject it, but that rejection is also like unspecified, right? Like the registry is now rejecting a thing that is otherwise valid due to its own preferences and whims and implementation, and that's not great for OCI.
I think it falls in the existing size-based limits.
Yeah, we've got limits on the max size of a manifest. And so if we add additional limits on saying all of your annotations must be within this threshold, that works as well.
And that threshold is 4 megabytes?
When I did the math here, if I did 100 items and a 4 megabyte limit there for the overall index, that gives you 40 kilobytes per descriptor. I think
Where are
you
you
can fit
getting
a lot of
100?
annotations in 40 kilobytes.
Where do you get 100 from?
I was just picking Michael's give 100 items per index and the response before you paginate.
Okay. So the annotation limit we're saying should be 4 KB, and then if you push something with more than that and it has a subject, John's allowed to reject it.
If it's got a subject, and that 4 KB is all annotations. Because you're looking at building a descriptor. So if you construct a descriptor with this and your media type size digest and all the annotations together exceed 40 kilobytes, then yes.
Yeah.
Because we still want to allow registries to support the data field for other stuff.
Yeah. John, does that sound good? Do you want to update your PR?
I will update my PR.
Excellent. Let's all promise to argue on the PR before next week so that we don't have to wait a whole week to argue again. This has been fun arguing, though. I feel like we really got somewhere. I want to unironically and completely genuinely say I think we made progress here.
And as much as we like to strangle each other, we politely strangled each other to a good place. So
it was a lot of good polite strangling, everyone. See you next week.
Bye, guys.